power, pushback, and the new gender wars. What is going on with this backlash around feminism, around gender equality, and what can we do about it? And we'll be joined by two excellent speakers who will take us through this conversation in this landscape. The first, Hungarian academic, Erzsébet Barát, and she'll be in conversation with philosophy teacher Matthew Pye. Please give them a round of applause. Thanks so much.
Yes, so good morning, and my voice is a little bit gravelly because I didn't maybe sleep enough last night either. But anyway, thank you again. I just echo what has been said. Brave soldiers, 11 o'clock this morning. So it's a real privilege to be on the stage with you. And we have two little ducks in the background with us too. Oh, it's just one
now. Yeah.
Oh, the other one will come back, I'm sure. So I just want to open up with a reflection about how amazing Zeg is in this one very particular respect. And that is, it's the first time I can remember in my life that I had to queue for a toilet. It never happens to me. So this is an extraordinary place because as a man, this is a totally new world to me, that over there that I had to actually queue for a toilet. And this is, I think, for me, I had a revelation about toilets a few years ago. And of course, I'm here as a white, English-speaking male, etc. So I'm feeling a little bit vulnerable with this topic. And I feel vulnerable because it's so easy to be blind to the injustices, to things which are systemically not right. And I think for me, I'm going to ask you in a minute for your own first experience of realizing gender war at whatever level. But for me, toilets was a real revelatory moment. And it happened the first time I realized that there was this incredible inequality about toilets was when I was running to catch a plane in an airport. And I could just go straight in and go to the toilet and catch my plane, but I ran past a whole line of women who were waiting for the toilet. And I'm still staggered that we don't design public spaces where you make the female section 30% bigger, like just as a rule. I mean, I just can't imagine if it was the other way around, that men would tolerate having to queue so consistently for the toilet. It just would never happen.
Okay.
So that's my revelatory moment. Perhaps you can share your...
Okay, mine is a different one. And it goes back to when I was 8 years old. And I remember walking home from school, passing this grammar school, which was 2 houses away. And a guy walked up to me, hailing me like, "Hey, little boy, could you tell me the time?" Now, you should understand that this is the late 90s in a small country town of 10,000 people, and you definitely didn't have a wristwatch for an 8-year-old second grader at that time ever. So my first watch came into my life when I went to this dormitory boarding school at the age of 14. So anyways, my response to all this back at then, it could have been in terms of sexuality now, in hindsight, I would say, but back then what I said was, I grabbed my earring, which as you can see, I don't have ever since. And I grabbed this, that was a present for my christening by my godparents, and I shouted in his face from below up to his face, like, "Don't you see I am a girl?" And then in 2 minutes, I am home and I demand my mom to remove those rings. And I have never ever worn earrings ever since, nor do I go for makeup. And the reason why I do this is because I understand that there are multiple ways of presenting ourselves as feminine or masculine, but I just do not buy into, ever since, it's really funny, I do not buy into an obvious common sense binary distinction between that's a woman, that's a man, and it's not helpful. It is to antagonize. It does not bring us together over anything. So if this talk today is going to be about anything, it is about challenging these self-explanatory, obvious, natural, or I would rather say naturalized boundaries. So thank you for inviting the story.
Yeah. And of course, that experience happened in Hungary.
Yep.
You grew up in Hungary. And so could you articulate for us some of the key ways, because Hungary, of course, is at the forefront of these pushbacks. And so what ways have you, at the moment, have you seen, or could you pick out where these wars or the gender thing is happening? And then we can take it from there to the wider.
Okay, so I don't just want to select the events, because if once they are dislocated like that, I make them into just a list, then I am killing the interpretative context for those events. In other words, I'm not going to tell you a story, but I am going to pontificate like, this is the list of events. So because I do gender studies, and what I have been focusing on is how the order of a hate rhetoric, the order of hate speech, has become the dominant mode of political communication in Hungary in the past 15 years. That's one thing. The other is what I have been trained since the mid-90s to hear, okay, is gender and sexuality relations. Now I can't help it, which means to me that whatever social event takes place, I always look out for the practices of gendering and sexualization involved in them. So I would never ever go along with an approach that would say like, okay, let's talk about gender issues now, or let's talk about race issues now. What I would say is like, let's see how this situation, how this particular event, okay, has been gendered as well, even if it is not necessarily the most explicit, most visible dimension of those political struggles. But because you asked me to mention events where gender is visibly in the forefront, but it is visibly in the forefront on terms of the regime, which is a very different thing. In other words, like, what does gender come to mean once it is in the center of state propaganda, right? And those events, I would say, would be the most painful one for me is the ban of an MA degree in gender studies. I mean, there is no other ban because there was not before that, and I'm talking about late August 2018 in Hungary. There was, at that moment, there was no BA degree or a PhD degree. For whatever reason, now it's beside the point, there was only an MA degree in gender studies. And that's problematic because any potential of reflecting on gender relations in the country cuts in both directions. It stops, okay, systematic critical thinking about it within academia, and it also solidifies very masculinist understandings of how life should be on terms of the right-wing populist government. Okay, that's been in powers ongoing fourth term now since 2010. So that's one event that happens, that's 2018. The other one is right at the very beginning of COVID, 2020 March, when the concept of sex at birth is introduced into legislation in order to preempt the possibility at that time, because it's tied up with a legal case in the European Court of Justice, where a trans-migrant person, a refugee, was denied to change their ID documents on the grounds that that the legislator had no right to say yes or no. In other words, there is a gap in the legal documents. And the resolution of this was not to allow that. Okay, so like introducing the concept of sex at birth, i.e. your ID documents cannot ever be changed, okay, beyond that moment of registry or registration. The third one is another change to the law, which goes back to May 2021, or sorry, June 2021, when the Hungarian government, in the name of protecting our children from pedophilia, okay, collapses pedophilia into the concept of homosexuality. In other words, it's a move when non-normalized sexualities come to be labeled as a criminal act. So to me, these are the three key events, all evolving around, one way or another, the understanding of what gender means and what gender should or should not mean.
And just before we started the session, we noticed these birds here. They look a little bit like Wittgenstein's rabbit duck thing. So we had a little chat about Wittgenstein. Now that sounds very, abstract and crazy, but but in Wittgenstein you said one of the things, because you at university you studied that he, in reading the Tractatus, there's a moment in that book where this discipline of categorizing things becomes difficult. Not that you have to read Wittgenstein to understand gender studies, but there is this human tendency to put things in categories, and then when things get problematic, that's really like the zone where things where you're particularly interested in. So is that a good frame for understanding? Because gender studies is a difficult area to think through, I think. And is this a good way to frame it, that the question of boundaries, questions of categories, and
it could be. Also, okay, so what I learned, okay, from him is like to understand that categorization takes place through like, if you wish, representative models of that category who seem to exhaust all the characteristic features understood to be the grounds for belonging. But as we move towards the boundaries of those categories, they would not exhibit or present all those features. And there comes a point which is fuzzy, because we are shifting into the grounds of something else. So I think that was my first encounter with fuzzy boundaries, flexible boundaries, or now I would say overlappings. So how it is not possible to differentiate in terms of clear-cut lines. But this also works with regard to what we mean by gender. And so far I have singled out how the system would have their very particular understanding of gender, which is something like sex-appropriate femininity and masculinity, which goes along the logic like if male, whatever that means, nobody questions, okay, because that's sort of like the anchoring point, and that is understood to be given by nature or biologically, or if you wish, even by God, but it's always either male or female. And if male, then masculine, if female, then feminine, and end of story. And everyone has got their proper place where they should feel home, and people should inhabit without any concerns or conflicts. But for me, if for nothing else, because at some point I had to go through the history of different feminist understandings of patriarchy, okay, which is problematized through the critical concept of gender. So I need to understand that there are many feminisms. Consequently, there are multiple meanings of gender. And if you have happened to visit YouTube in the past month or so, you can encounter a very nice interview with Judith Butler, who is interviewed after the publication of their book, Who's Afraid of Gender? And the major point Butler would like to underscore is precisely that, i.e., feminism, or feminisms, we should say, have always been, whether it is a movement or an academic approach, have always been about precisely to question what dominant understandings of gender, okay, in patriarchal societies would want us to buy into. So now, to counter this kind of discourse by coming up with the right definition of gender is not going to work. Because, for two things. One, it is the same normative logic of the powerful, i.e., like we need to know who belongs where, and on the grounds of biology. Okay, now if you want to appropriate the master's stool, to refer you to another feminist thinker, it is not going to work like that. It's not just like we are reversing, precisely because we come from within a social position which is less powerful. Consequently, one thing at least, because we think about this, we could try, is to find another logic that informs our understandings of drawing distinctions. So I'm not arguing against categories, because then we need to encode. We need code systems to make sense of the world. So we can't live in that sense without categorizations. But what we need to understand is like what power matrix these distinctions come to be caught in, like what certain categorizations are going to make look natural, common sense, obvious, and if not desirable, if we have problems with it, but definitely unchangeable. In other words, we should stop trying to change them. So that's why my understanding of how to draw distinctions is much more informed at that moment by Wittgenstein's thinking, and it has changed or developed or become more nuanced, more rich ever since. But in my understanding, all hierarchical systems of power would always mobilize categorizations in terms of binaries. And that's why I would say that feminists or feminism would have always challenged these binary distinctions. So, and we should be happy to inhabit, if you wish, the borderland, the nowhere land, the flexible spaces that are open to change and reshape.
That's very helpful, because I think just to first recognize the fact that there is a human instinct to put words on things. It's a form of control, just in terms of like the birth of language at its most basic is an attempt to control the world like that, which is in a sense a healthy instinct. That's normal for us to want to manipulate, understand, and put labels on things and so on. But what you're saying is that this becomes weaponized, and particularly when you have this binary setup of good, evil, male, female, etc. And it helps me to, I mean, I'm learning as I'm sat here, I'm learning myself to, because it's, once you have ambiguities, that's where creativity is, that's where humans can develop most freely. So how can we then defend that space? What are some success, given that this is gender wars, given that there is a pushback, given that there's a kind of tribalism at the moment. We have gender, it's a bit like, this is not a reference to last night and drunk people, but when you have 4 drunk men or women walking down a road, if one falls, all 4 would fall together. There's kind of a grouping, isn't there, that gender, along with intellectuals, along with institutions, there's an attack on these things which is happening. So how do we, what's the best successful strategy for maintaining openness, creativity? How because it sounds like from the title and from the blurb, it sounds like we're losing this war a little bit. So what are we doing wrong, and what can we do better?
Okay. So the very metaphor of culture wars, in the center of which I can see this anti-gender politics thriving, does mobilize that binary, okay? And even makes us attacked by the enemy inevitable, and at the same time to fight back legitimate. Okay, so this is what is at stake. And I would say that this kind of distinction also indirectly, sometimes it is spelled out, okay? What it takes for granted is that we want to fight them, the enemy, okay? Because what is being under siege is our safety. Now, and this safety is imagined to be anchored in sameness, right? We all know that we are the same because we are after the same what is morally true, okay? That's what is from the 1990s in the center of all these cultural wars, okay? Like to define on whose terms actually moral truth is going to prevail. Now, against this myth of safety, I would start by, precisely because of these ambiguous, fuzzy boundaries, I would start by bringing back the explicit acknowledgement of the feeling of discomfort, right? So it is very much integral to our existence, right? So discomfort, okay, might be productive of ways of living together that invites us to speak across the differences, to speak across, even to understand that difference must be absolute in order for me to know myself as I believe myself to be. And what I'm trying to look for, okay, feminist scholars who would want to embrace this sense of discomfort, partly because, not that they say it, but now I can add, so this is how I piece my story, my academic story together, is because in this so-called post-truth society, I don't like that name, okay? I would rather call it parliamentary autocracy. That's much closer to the naming. But anyways, this moment, okay, embraces so much the hostility towards the other, trust only us who are the same, who are like us, okay? All getting in the way of building any kind of sense of belonging, any kind of solidarity. And this other kind of solidarity that builds on the understanding of discomfort actually is called affective solidarity, and that was first introduced by Claire Hemmings, I think 2012. She's based at LSE in London, the London School of Economics, in the Gender Studies program there. And she would argue that this is something that allows us to talk across this difference. And this is something that can speak against the disaffectionate consensus that can be achieved under the current circumstances. In other words, most people who would be disappointed with what goes on would argue that I don't like this, okay, I can't relate to this, but I don't see any better option, no more appealing alternative, so I go along with it. More explicitly or less explicitly, trying to withdraw from it all, but not fighting back. So I would say that one way of fighting back this affectionate consent, okay, can be to embrace understanding, belonging together, solidarity as a space. I would say that is organized by the affordances of I trust you because I know you agree with me, and I trust you because I know that I can disagree with you without being labeled as your enemy if I don't go along with you. Do you see? So I don't stop on the border of sameness, okay? Because there is also, like, this is a space of trust where I can disagree without being labeled. Now, having said that, I would also add, and Hemmings does not consider this, but I would also add that nevertheless, there always is if you wish, a red line, because we have to speak from somewhere specific. We can't speak from all over the place. So in that sense, we can't say that any kind of disagreement I go along with. And in the context of culture wars evolving around anti-gender politics, I would say that this red line, which we would have to try to persuade each other to be a red line, is that what we are fighting against, because that's what we need to fight back, is the privileges and entitlements, and also the anxiety over losing those entitlements of hegemonic masculinity. And this hegemonic masculinity, to me, at the moment, is not just about white supremacy. It's also about colonization. It's also about patriarchal entitlements. It's also about normalizing particular ways of living sexuality. It is also about maintaining the privilege of those who can make financial profit out of how the social economy is organized. So, and that's much more important for everyone to understand, provided we also understand intellectually, if you wish, that these things intersect. So we can't just, that's why I started by saying that we can't just compartmentalize and say, like, now we are dealing with gender issues. And once we are done with them, we put the tick and we go on to the next one.
And I'm amazed at two levels by things. At the top end, you have the Taliban, which this is just the most extraordinary, visceral fear of women and gender wars played out like that in a militaristic way. But also, just from my classroom, if I share an anecdote, in my school we had a Smash the Patriarchy Day, and we had plates which represented the page. So these were patriarchy. So we had plates, and women wrote down their stories on these plates, and we had a space in the school where they could smash and throw those plates and make, like a Greek wedding or something. And it was it was amazing cathartic experience, and that was a very powerful thing. And part of that day, we also had a biscuit sale. So we sold biscuits, but the biscuits cost 30% more for the men. So the boys in the school had to pay €1.30, and the girls just paid €1, and to illustrate the gender pay gap. And the response from my otherwise extremely cultured, wonderful men that I teach philosophy to, and we have very civilized discussions about identity or freedom or whatever. We can do Marx together, we can do Sartre. They suddenly became like, I thought they would be curious about that. They were not curious, they were angry. They felt victimized. And I was astonished by their reaction to that. They just couldn't process this. They felt they were being attacked. So that link. So at the top end, you have the Taliban performing this horrific militaristic thing, but then I saw how, just at a very base level, like it is threatening. Like when you start to challenge these things, suddenly what comes to the surface are some very strong, primitive human emotions, which are hard to manage.
I would just like to say one thing. I see why you mentioned the Taliban, but I would also stay within our otherwise civilized spaces.
Yep.
Partly because one argument from the refugees coming through the Balkan route in 2015, okay, in great numbers, because at that time, predominantly because of the Syrian war, there is the discourse in Hungary, which is highly not just misogynistic, but in the first place, most explicitly, it is very Islamophobic. And according to the logic of cultural wars, the Hungarian government's main argument would be like, we must defend our women from them. Okay? And what I would like to say that this appeal, okay, or this legitimization of their disgusting anti-refugee politics builds on the assumption, what goes without saying as obvious, is that our women have nothing to fear from our men. Now, I almost showed my middle finger, like, because nothing is further from the truth. You know, you have horrible cases, like the most recent one is where a woman in her mid-40s got her face punched to like unrecognizable, like into like just flesh, into pulp by her partner in a bar in the evening, at night, in front of other guests, and this guy is a retired colonel, okay, around 50. And she could not, for a long while, could not bring him to court. This was going on in the past 5 years, okay? And then it took her, I don't know how much to prove in court that she did not provoke. Can you guess this? She did not provoke all those hits. And then the guy eventually, okay, found guilty, but he got away with 1 year of suspended imprisonment, and I can't tell you how much fine, okay? That's it. So relative to our civilized spaces, so to me this is the point, like what we compare, okay, our situation with. And that's why I don't want to go to the example of the Taliban, okay? But I would like to stay within, okay, the Hungarian space, like how much relative to, this is the relative boundaries for you, right? Relative to what prevails as the norm in Hungarian society, you can commit just as much of a horrendous atrocity systematically against women. Like, the statistics in this field are never reliable, okay? Because women would not come forward that readily at all, if for nothing else, precisely because of this kind of treatment. And I have not talked about the imposition of the trauma on you to relive it zillion times in the course of the procedure. But what I would also like to underscore is that you have zero credibility on your own grounds, okay, within that system. So anything that gets heard as a woman's voice becomes routinely discredited or is given less credentials than when something is heard as a man is speaking. Even if in that court situation, the man speaking is the alleged perpetrator. And you can go anywhere for examples like that.
Yeah, thank you. Very powerful. I'll open it up for questions. We have 10, 15 minutes more. Other points? Maybe there's a mic floating around. I mean, mic as in a microphone. I don't know if there's an actual Michael here. Huh? I know it's still early in the morning. I think what I appreciated about it's actually a theme for me in Zeg. I've been in different sessions, and I went to the prisoner in cell. You know, this very powerful documentary.
Yeah, I was there too.
And what struck me there was the power of humility, and what you were saying about being vulnerable, the importance of being vulnerable. That in this session, that was just my reflection.
Okay, thanks for mentioning vulnerability, because now just to make even more abstract, to bring along something even more abstract, okay, is that because the cultural war is so much about what counts or what is considered as moral truth, which in itself is a bizarre conflict between terms, okay? Not what is morally right, but what is morally true is really an odd concern, but I don't want to go that way. But having said that, in terms of this epistemology, like what kind of solidarity is this affectionate solidarity that does not mobilize sameness or does not require sameness, but starts with the understanding of discomfort, which we have to live up to and expect while we negotiate where we stand. It's very much as Judith Butler's concept of the ethics, the radical ethics of cohabitation. And that cohabitation is built on the understanding that the ontological condition of all human beings' existence is that we are vulnerable. So vulnerability. And therefore, all forms of life, not just the human forms of life, is grievable when we lose it. Now, but this vulnerability needs to be explained, like, what is the source of this vulnerability? Where does it come from? Why do we say that we are all vulnerable beings by definition? And she would argue that, okay, it's an ontological condition in the sense that all forms of life are lodged in one another. Okay, now, yeah?
Because there's a philosophy teacher in me here, I just want to... Ontology is the technical way of saying being. What is it to be? So
I thought he would want to explain to be lodged in.
No.
So anyways, what I want to say is to be lodged in means, okay, that one way or another, we are all intertwined, even if through a chain of existence, okay? But there comes always the point where I am confronted with the understanding that something in me, more or less, is also there in you, right? So in that sense, we are lodged in one another. And because of this, we never know how this works out, what is going to happen. So if you wish, in a way, ethically speaking, it makes us more, well, maybe I would say humble, to understand that when I think that I am out getting at you unexpectedly, it can easily backfire in the sense that that very same thing is in me, and I am, in that sense, attacking myself as well. So in that sense, it's an ethics of cohabitation, right? To understand this being lodged in one another.
It's when you speak, you remind me of one of the features of climate change, and because that's my other. So I teach philosophy, but I also have a lot to do. I have a climate academy, which is all about trying to advance understanding of the climate crisis and civic engagement. And when you're speaking there about this about vulnerability, I think it reminds me in climate change that often when I speak on climate change, and it is of course catastrophic. There are tipping points ahead. There's a systems crisis, a polycrisis. Often people want to know, what can I do? Which is of course an entirely normal reaction. But what I think is important in the climate context is just a bravery to hold out the situation as it is, the facts, the scientific data, and be vulnerable to that, allow ourselves to be vulnerable to, well, it is just a crisis, and not trying too quickly wrap it up into a solution and because what often happens then in schools, especially as a teacher, is that we reduce the student capacity for engagement into sort of trivial individual actions, which are they're impotent essentially, and not the big system question. So there's a kind of funny doubleness there in that you have to be both vulnerable but also tough, like resilient, and that for climate action and for climate thinking, we need to sustain both of those things in order to find solutions which are systemic, solutions which are powerful, because otherwise things collapse too quickly into cliches or into ineffective things.
Okay, for a closing statement, maybe what I would like to say is that what I took with me from that documentary yesterday about how the inmates in this California jail, the guys, had feminist classes, and made themselves better men, okay? What I would say is that what they were doing and have been doing ever since is living with an understanding and with the emotions of discomfort, like being faced with their shortcomings and like what to do with them and how to move away from them. So in that sense, like, I suppose we just have to live with that affect, if you wish, this discomfort.
Thank you very much for your time. If there is a chance for, there is a question now. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's a bittersweet moment for me because Erzsébet is my mentor, my friend, one of the people that you meet in your life and make a really irreversible, very important mark on your thinking, on your identity as a woman. It's funny that you and I should meet after 20-something years here in Tbilisi, still talking about gender wars and hegemonic masculinity, because we were discussing that so long ago. You were my supervisor, of course, of my MA thesis. But personal sentiments aside, I really want to hear your perspective on, you spoke so eloquently about Hungary's position in this global international, basically new or post-fascistic order. Hungary is just one part of it. Georgia, unfortunately, is also one. But I personally do believe that we need to call things for what they are. This is right-wing, at least, populist new front that we're confronted with. Populist, not just in the sense of politicians, this right-wing male politicians speaking on behalf of the people. But most importantly, what populism is, that we are the people and you are not. You don't count. It's just us. We are the only ones who represent the real people. And yes, they attack identity politics. They attack wokeism. They have various terms for it. But it seems to me that this new fascist international is in itself identity politics on steroids. This is a hysterical manifestation of white male masculinity it's been going on for decades now, from Putin's bare-chested horse riding or karate, or the way Trump, what he personifies as a type of masculinity, this toxic, bullying, uncompromising, not emphatic. But there is some element of performativity in it. And maybe fragility as well. That's why I know it's an oxymoron. Some theories would tell you to pair masculinity with hysteria, but it does seem like this is maybe hopefully the last big eruption, and I'm using this word specifically here, of the white, toxic, hegemonic masculinity, the way, whatever that might mean. So what does this gendered element of not just what they're attacking, but how they present themselves, like Orban, family man? I mean, this is everywhere. This is undeniable, and I know you see it. It's inseparable part of this new front, the masculinity performance. What does that tell us about the white male hegemonic masculinity, if you like?
Okay.
Thank you.
Maybe I got it, what you're asking. So I would say two things. One is that when I say that something has become dominant, it also means that it catches up with those who would identify as people, organizations disidentifying with the regime, right? And that's sad, okay? It's very, very sad. So that's why I thought that a new ground for coming together is needed, because there is no point in fighting each other within feminism, like to the point where, so who is going to win the day in terms of the right definition of gender, and people go along with the populist discourse because they don't know what gender is. And now we are going to make up for that mistake we have made. So that's one thing I would say, that it really does not differentiate between the ugly official propaganda and us who are targeted by it, because we are also caught in it in many ways. As for what kind of gender politics there is, I think that is the other question you asked, like what is it indicative of, this kind of masculinist discourse made desirable, okay, in the sense that, okay, I'm not like that yet, but I aspire to be like that, or I am happy to vote for that because that is something that represents what is important or valuable for me. I would say what they are trying to do there is really naturalize that gender is something that is a matter of particular ways of presenting ourselves. And they want that through bringing back, I would say, at the expense of women, okay, or actual women, in that they want to valorize this female figure of reproduction. So all there is that matters about a woman's life these days is like to procreate. But it's not that in actual fact. That's what they say. But when you look at it through this intersectional lens, what you see there is that this is a very disgusting eugenistic program. Like we want only particular kind of upper class white women to reproduce, okay? We don't want Roma women in Hungary, for one thing, to reproduce even if they are educated. And it's also about making those upper middle class women to believe that all there is to their life is also to walk about, okay, and be terribly proud of the offsprings, because that's their contribution to life, and at the same time be dependent on, okay, and accept all the dirty money that the oligarch husband brings home to make this family survive. So what I'm trying to say is that this, and of course all this is done with an appeal to defending Christian values, like the proper way of living. So we are back into this unexpectedly, because if you look at the statistics, Hungarian people are not particularly religious. They wouldn't go to church on a regular basis even, let alone they wouldn't see themselves for whom faith matters. So I would say they do have this new female figure in the forefront that can capture all the basic values that they would want this neo-fascist regime to turn to and be built on.
Thank you very much. Great question. And thank you for all of your insights. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming along.